Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about questionnaire design, but really specifically about the bias and implications that come out of designing a questionnaire. So just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded, and I'll be sending out the recording at the end of the webinar. There's going to be a chance for a question and answer at the end, so you can put any questions you've got in the Q&A box, but I also encourage you to use the chat function. Feel free to talk to each other. If you can think of any really good examples of these bias that you've come across that you want to share, that you'd like to talk to people about, or that you think would be interesting to discuss with us directly at the end of the webinar, feel free to start putting those in there. Be really interactive and yeah, feel free to share your ideas, and we'll see what comes out of it. So yeah, today we're not going to go through how to design a questionnaire necessarily. That's quite a big process with lots of different things. So we're really just going to look at what bias means when we're looking at questionnaire design. And people sort of saw the description of what I talked about before. I think what's really interesting about bias is obviously a lot of the time you want to negate it. You don't want to have bias necessarily, but sometimes you can really use it to your advantage. And so it's really thinking about how we can do it to make sure that we get the most valid data, but also that we can make sure we achieve our research objectives as well. So to give you a little bit of a summary of our agenda, we'll be looking at framing and what it means for designing your questionnaire. So that in terms of wording and the order. We'll be looking at some examples of different kinds of bias. So we've got kind of general terms, but also really specific things to do with the questionnaire design itself. And we'll just be sharing lots of examples and case studies as we go through, so you can really put things into context. Because you can imagine this is a pretty interesting topic with lots of different variables. So we'll just be throwing lots of examples at you today to get you to see it all in a bit of context as well. So I am joined by Thomas today. Thomas, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Carys. So I'm Thomas Marquardt. I'm heading the German division of F8 Global Research, and I'm a market researcher not only by profession but also by passion. So I've been in market research almost all my professional life, most of the time in Unilever, where I had the pleasure of, in the end, having a global role and being able to travel the world and seeing what's happening in the world. But I started very much on a data-driven side of market research, but the longer I worked in market research, the more I found it actually appealing and interesting and exciting to react to human psychology and see how people react and how people act, and also realizing, well, I'm coming from business economics, realizing that this kind of homo economicus, the pure rational beings, don't exist. we are all humans, and we are all very much driven by emotions and by pictures, and understanding this, of course, is key in market research. And I think it also came back here today when we see actually when we talk about framing and talk about how actually our mind and our psychology is affected by what we see and what we hear. And that's why I'm looking forward actually to share some of our thoughts with you.
Thanks, Thomas. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the regulatory director at Aiton Global Research. So I've been at the company for about 8 years now and have designed a lot of studies and questionnaires and things like that. So I've really got to see this firsthand, implications of bias from that side. But really, mainly my speciality in regulations means that we need to make sure that if we have got any bias in our questionnaire, it isn't going to make studies uncompliant. So as many of you probably know, one of the main reasons we conduct studies is for claims substantiation. So we need to make sure that we're making sure there's no bias in the study and the questionnaire, and if it is there, that it's not going to be affecting the data in a way that's essentially too complementary, and therefore the claims aren't really fair. So that's really where I'm coming from, kind of that side a lot, when we're looking at bias in questionnaires as well. So just to give you kind of a bit of an introduction, just what is consumer research? Because obviously market research is a really huge service. It can be lots of different things. So we're going to try and keep things really specific to consumer research today. So we're looking at product testing a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean we are testing products, because obviously you can be getting consumer feedback as well, through kind of online questionnaires and things like that. But we will give a lot of examples of product testing because, as I said, I think it's a lot of you will be coming from a product testing perspective, looking at things like claims substantiation. So we'll be talking about that a lot. So when we're talking about consumer research, we're really looking at perception claims. So again, that kind of makes you think about how we're framing bias. We're asking about people's opinions. So obviously anything you can give a bias, you can easily lead someone's opinion about things. So it's really making sure that we understand that a lot when we're looking at product testing and claims as well. So yeah, it's basically looking at people's opinions about products. They're generally testing products at home and answering an online questionnaire. And I'll talk about that a little bit because that helps with bias as well. We're looking at the actual conditions of the product in use. So rather than a clinical study where people might go to a laboratory or a clinic and have a product applied, we're actually looking at sending out the products with their usage directions and getting that genuine feedback from how they will purchase the products as well. We look at things like product comparison as well. Again, we've got some examples of that because there are some good examples there. So it's not just about testing one product, there could be comparisons there. For some claims, you might need additional evidence, and I can always provide examples of that. If you've got any claims that essentially want to get substantiated, feel free to talk to us and we'll be able to suggest what the best evidence is for that as well. But there's kind of lots of other reasons you conduct consumer research and not claim substantiation alone, which again is, I'm thinking a lot of you will probably be here to look at those other reasons as well today. Generally, it should be something that's built into the new product development sort of process. Getting feedback on your products is a kind of huge advantage to you, even if you're not just looking at claims, but getting feedback on your products. Because before you do things like launch into new markets, launch with new consumers, launch a new formulation that you haven't tried before, it's really great to get this genuine feedback from real people and find out what they have to say about it. So it's certainly something, it's not just about kind of getting that, ticking boxes and saying, okay, I've done a consumer research study, I can say this about my product. You should be wanting to find out what people have to say about it. It will help you sell your products in the sort of most advantageous way. So you really get these ideas about how people perceive your product and your brand. This can be anything to do with packaging design as well, things like the price points. It's all really good things you can get feedback on. Things like benchmark testing and reformulation. So as I say, comparisons. Investigating new markets, as I've mentioned. So when we think about that, it might not just be looking at a global market, but it could be I've developed a baby care product. So that's a new market for me. You can also gain other kind of feedback, such as photos and videos and testimonials and reviews. So there's lots that we can get out of your study, and not necessarily, like I said, just kind of that checking a box. I've got some examples of the kind of claims we can substantiate there as well, and kind of things you can put into your marketing from it, just to give you some examples there. But we won't go into it too much detail today because we really want to talk to you about this questionnaire bias. So Thomas, get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Carys. I think we start. I just want to kick off with this quote that you all know: "You only have one chance to make a first impression." And I think you realize this. Well, definitely, if you go for trying to get a new job or go on a first date or whenever you enter a new situation. This is widely known and widely accepted, but the same thing, of course, the same principle applies everywhere. So also if you introduce a concept, if you introduce a new idea, if you introduce a pack, whatever you show first will stick and will have an impact on everything else that follows after. So just as a kind of teaser to start, think of it actually that the first impression has a major impact.
Absolutely. And that really takes us on to our first type of bias. The first one I want to talk about is social desirability bias. And it really does kind of, as well as having your product and everything like that, this is what people are like. They do want to be desirable, essentially. So there's 3 different types of social desirability bias as outlined by the Market Research Society. So you've got impression management. People want to look good. So, it's one of these things. I put the kind of recycle bins there as the picture because this happens every time we do a sustainability market research study. It tends to be the main one because you ask people how often do they recycle, they'll say, oh, all the time, even if they don't, generally. So it's finding out, again, how do we manage that bias in that kind of example? Things like an ego defense, so not even necessarily wanting to look good to other people, but thinking to themselves that they want to be a better person than they currently are. And also instrumentation, so deliberately lying in the hope of bringing about change. And again, I think it's a really good example with the kind of sustainability, green kind of world that we have. People might pretend they're a bit better, kind of with what their hobbies are and their actions, to try and bring about that change as well. So it does, it applies for lots of different things, but I think it's interesting how you do get these kind of hurdles when you're looking at investigating these kinds of things, because people are complicated, and they certainly we all certainly want to be a little bit better than we necessarily are. So how do we deal with that? So one really good way of dealing with it is online questionnaires, which again is what we really specialize in, because obviously people don't have to lose face, they're being asked online, so it's a bit of an easier one. You can do things like extending answer scales. So an interesting one with this is always when you say to people, how often do you drink? If you start the scale at once a week, and then once a month, once a year, if they do more than that, they're going to select the answer that's right at the beginning, because they don't want to look really bad. Whereas if you start the answer with 20 drinks a day, and then kind of bring it down, they're going to go more towards the middle and be a bit more honest. So essentially, it's things like having these answer scales, which are quite extreme, well, not necessarily extreme, but give them lots of options that don't make them look like they're the worst necessarily. Things like exactly like that with recycling, for example, instead of saying, how often do you remember to separate your plastics from your cardboards? And if you said, kind of made that something that was very, very often and very, very far apart, they would be somewhere in the middle generally. So that's always a really good way to start that. Reassuring confidentiality is always really important. So for example, with us, we make it very, very clear to our participants that their data is confidential, they're protected, they're anonymized. They have to be under the GDPR Act, but again, it's really helpful for them to know that they are going to be completely anonymous. They're just a number on a page when it comes to data. And appealing to people's honesty. So again, it's that whole thing, sort of thinking really honestly, phrasing the question like, if you are really honest, how often do you actually recycle? That kind of thing. And you'd be surprised, it does help. It does help, because you kind of appeal to that personal level and be like, if you're really not going to lie, what do you think about this? And people do tend to be a bit more honest. So again, I mean, it doesn't mean that we're completely negating this bias. There's always going to be there, but whatever we can do to try and help is what we'll try and do there.
Okay, and the big topic, I think the big thing we wanted to talk about today is framing. So we put the picture of a frame. The frame in which your message or questions are presented has a major impact on how people perceive it, and also how people respond to questions. That's why it's always a bit tricky if you read a newspaper, the answer to a poll, because often you don't really know the frame that was put behind it. And depending on who has ordered the study, they might set a completely different frame. So for instance, if you think of a simple question like, would you be in favor of raising the petrol prices? Depending on the frame, the outcome might be completely different. So if you start by framing saying, actually, we all know the environment is horrible, and we've got the climate crisis, and cars have a major impact on the climate crisis. So increasing the petrol prices would reduce the impact on the environment. And then ask the question, would you be in favor of raising the petrol prices? Versus, for instance, from another angle, would say, there are so many people who commute to work every day, and they are just struggling actually to find their balance financially. And petrol prices, actually, their car is actually a major impact on their cost, their cost of living. So raising petrol price actually would make their commute to work much more expensive. So would you be in favor of raising petrol prices? It's the same question. And you can be pretty sure the outcome would be very difficult and very different. And depending on actually who is behind the study, you might steer the outcome, which actually then gives you the news headlines in one way or the other. And we'll share some more examples of this framing. That's just for the overall picture. So that's why I say people are not really human rational beings. So you can frame by using the right attributes. So just an example of how likely would you be buying this ground beef? You might describe this brief as 80% lean, or you might describe the brief as containing 20% fat. So again, the word as such, it's the same beef. The outcome will be different. Or takes another example, positive versus negative claims. Positive claims always have a different impact, or in general, we like to think positive, and in general, it's also better in market research to use positive claims. But again, it has an impact. So just took an example of what you think of a condom that has a success rate of 95% versus a condom that has a failure rate of 5%. I don't know the results of the outcome, but I'm pretty sure that the acceptance of a condom with a high success rate would be higher than the success rates of than the agreement rate of a condom with the failure rate of 5%. Next one. It's also very important actually to think of your wordings and how you word things. In general, it's always recommendable to use consumer language and not too complicated concepts or words, because you have to realize that not everybody is intelligent and understands the full concept. So there was an interesting example that I found the other day where I say, do you think prices in general will go up over the next 12 months? Or do you think inflation will go up over the next 12 months? And you see that even though inflation, of course, is the prices in general, scientifically, it's more or less the same. If people think of prices in general, they tend to think of their food shopping, everything they do every day. Versus if you think of inflation, they think much more macroeconomically, things that do not really impact them so much, even though, of course, inflation is measured as prices in general. So expectations for inflations tend to be much lower than for prices in general. So just by phrasing differently, you will get a different outcome. And depending on what you, as I said, if you have a certain intention with your study, you can steer it in one way or the other, which is slightly manipulative, but still probably right, as long as you're clear on what you're doing. Another nice thing that I think of is anchoring. Anchoring means that whenever you, for instance, take a number, it sets an anchor. So if you take a question like how many dentists are there in London, nobody knows and nobody will look at the phone book. But if you say, if you add the subline, it will certainly be more than 10, because 10 is a ridiculously low number. People will think of much higher than 10. So maybe 1,000 is much higher than 10. So maybe it's 5,000 or 6,000. If you start with how many dentists are in London, it will be certainly less than 1 million. 1 million is a ridiculously high number, so people will go significantly below the number of million, but significantly below is maybe 100,000. So maybe you estimate 50,000. At any rate, the overall estimate, the average estimate for the first variant will be much lower than the average estimate for the second starting point, even though the question is the same and nobody really knows it. But just by giving a first number, you set an anchor that determines the answer. And this is something actually that Carys already mentioned at the beginning. Scale has an impact. So I just took a price scale, for instance. What price do you think would be suitable for this product, starting from less than €1, going up to more than €5, versus less than €1 and going up to more than €9? You may bet that the average outcome in the second variant will be higher, because people have a tendency not to go for outliers and always a tendency to vote somewhere in the middle. So that's why whenever you've got any estimation question, it's extremely difficult. Any reference you're giving is having an impact on the outcome.
So it's a really good example with price as well, because I think we have that a lot of price questions. And like you said, if you make it too low, people will think, oh, the product's not worth a lot. Whereas if you kind of bring it up a lot higher, you'd be surprised what people would pay for it because they think it's worth it. So I think that's a great example.
Yeah. That's an also interesting psychological example. The third option. This is often brought in if you want to sell things in quite a clever way, but it also has an impact on the questionnaire. So there was an interesting experiment where they said actually you can get a reward for free, and in the first alternative it was €6 or a luxury pen. And then a second option was €6, a cheap pen or luxury pen. Very obviously, nobody wants a cheap pen. We got the choice between a cheap pen and a luxury pen. But having a cheap alternative creates additional value for the luxury pen. So whilst in the first case, it may be 50-50 for the €6 luxury pen, and the second one, maybe 1/3 and 2/3. So 2/3 will go for the luxury pen. So by just adding a third option that nobody takes, you upgrade one of the other options. It was actually for instance, also a newspaper subscription, where you have then sometimes the option of having the real newspaper and an online newspaper, and more or less and this for the same price as only the online newspaper or whatever. But anyway, you can steer the options people choose by giving alternative options. Another example I saw the other day is that is also depending on if you ask the question positively or negatively. So this was a study done already in 1941, so some time ago. But they asked, do you think that the US should forbid public speeches against democracy? And you saw that 54% agreed. And they asked another group of people, do you think that the US should allow public speeches against democracy? And then suddenly you saw 75% disagree. So there's a huge mismatch, and you could phrase it either way, and you have enough reason actually to publish the news that how many people are against the permittance of public speech against democracy. So just by asking the question in one way or the other has an impact.
I think political polls are really a really interesting way of people doing this. They did a really good experiment with the Scottish independence vote, and they said, do you think Scotland should be independent, yes or no? And it was kind of a 50-50. And then they said, do you think Scotland should be, and it said independent or stay part of the UK? And it really changed the significance, just because they didn't say yes or no, but they chose one of the options. So yeah, I think it's always really interesting to see how people can change. Like I said,
I think there was a huge debate about the Brexit question, how this was phrased or not.
Yeah. We won't go there. That takes us on to the next type of bias, so acquiescence bias, and that's a really good example actually of this. So people tend to have a really positive reaction to questions. It's a lovely thing that people like to do. We like to be really positive, but obviously that's not always great when we're talking about bias, because we don't want people just to agree with things. We do want to get genuine opinions, and as I said, that's a really good example, because we've got one of the ways to deal with it is to make options explicit rather than just a yes or no. So as I say, when you say, should Scotland be independent, then people will tend to go, yes, I think they should be. Whereas if you give them the option and say, what do you think Scotland should be, independent or part of the UK, it really changed the results. I'm sorry I haven't got the example up, otherwise I'll be able to show you the exact numbers there. But it made a huge difference, because people weren't just being asked if they agree. It's actually something that we tend to do on purpose in claim substantiation. We say, it's really positive. Do you agree? And they're like, yeah. So obviously, without being too leading, it is the reason why you try and be quite positive, because you don't want to be really negative when you're putting answers out there. So that's kind of my last point there, but I'll say it already. So think about whether the questions have been worded positively. It is something we see a lot. You don't want to kind of put that bad impression in people's mind either. So for example, one of the things that we've had before is the product makes my hands feel dry. That's going to be something that's quite negatively answered. Whereas you go, the product is not drying on my hands, you'd be really surprised what people kind of answer that way. So yeah, we try and do it in a positive manner, because it's easier for people to agree with a statement than disagree with a negative statement, if you understand what I mean. Also offering positive answers first can reinforce the acquiescence bias. So we try and think about negative to positive format for answers. So that's something we do try and do as a standard. So if we have a question like that, the product doesn't feel drying on my hands, we'll say strongly disagree to strongly agree. There are lots of arguments. Some of our clients like to word it the other way around, but obviously we want to make sure that we're not kind of pushing this bias as much as possible. And on the other side, our volunteers are very used to answering questions that way. And there is really an importance of keeping a kind of cohesion throughout of our studies. So the more we can get them to answer that way, the better. It also means we can compare easier for different products and things like that. But generally, that is how we like to word things. So always say strongly disagree first and go on to strongly agree and kind of keep it in that format.
Mm-hmm. As we've said before, actually words can make a difference. And this was a nice example I came across the other day, where people were shown a video, and then afterwards they were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? So people were just asked to make a speed estimate. And then another test group said, how fast were the cars going when they collided with each other? And surprise, surprise, there was a big difference in response. So people who had the kind of smashing thing had a mental image of smashing, which means really speedy and fast. So they had a much higher estimate of the speed than for the group who just talked about colliding. And it doesn't stop here. So as a follow-up question, people were asked if they had seen broken glass on the picture in the video. And again, people that has been asked about cars smashing into each other, that has created kind of mental film, a mental picture of a strong accident. Well, obviously there's glass coming with it. So they're significantly more often reported having seen broken glass than the test group of people who talked about a collision. By the way, there was no broken glass in the video. So it shows actually how a frame you set, and the frame is just by talking about cars smashing into each other. You create this kind of frame, the kind of picture of a heavy accident, which certainly also as will show glass on the video. Another thing that I think is really important is the order of questions, and I think this is one of the most difficult parts in questionnaire design, because every question has an impact on the subsequent question. Because you've probably now seen it and realized actually that everything creates a frame and has an impact. So every question has an impact on the questions that follow, which means the most important question should be the beginning and not at the end. Or you really need to think of the interaction each question should have with each other, and then define the order. So that's really tricky. Or sometimes you can overcome it by rotating questions. So make sure that every question has the same chance to be first and last. There was another interesting example I saw the other day where they had the two questions: how happy are you with your life in general, and how happy are you with your romantic relationship? And interesting thing was that if you ask this in this order, the agreement to life in general was much higher than if you put it in the other order, because it's also a question of how people interpret this question. So if you start with how happy are you with your life in general, and then ask how happy are you with your romantic relationship, they really concentrate on a relationship. If you ask the other way around, how happy are you with your romantic relationship, and then ask how happy are you with your life in general, people tend to think about life in general apart from romantic relationships. So you come to different interpretations of the question, even though if they are phrased in the same way. The big recommendation, and this is something I'm continue to stress with my clients, start with the general questions. So whenever you've got any general questions, especially in terms of overall liking, overall acceptance, over price, over buying intention, recommendation to friends, whatever it is, ask about them first, because any other questions you've had in between will have an impact on this. And this is most likely one of the most important questions you're having. So rather concentrate on that one in the beginning, and take it in the beginning, and go into details later. And we'll share a case study on this in a minute. Here we are already at the case study. So the case study, we this time we didn't take a case study from our experience in Aiton, because obviously we are not experimenting with our clients and making alternative questionnaires to compare the outcome. This is a case study that I found in literature, which I quite liked, because it really makes the point. So this was someone who wanted to find out from a range of chocolate mousses which ones are the best. So consumers were asked to rate different chocolate mousses. The objective very simply identify the best liked chocolate mousse. So in the next chart, you see the overall liking. So this was the first test group. Just people tasted chocolate mousse and gave an overall liking score, which is shown over here. I think it probably was a 9-point scale. And you see very clearly chocolate mousse A is scoring the best, followed by D. B and C are still okay. F is the loser. But very clear results. If you only had these results, you would go for chocolate mousse A. Then they had another test group where they tasted chocolate mousse and had to rate them on a number of product attributes. So what about the consistency, about the mouthfeel, about the sweetness, about different things that they evaluated the chocolate mousse on. And at the end, they were asked the same question: give the overall liking score. And interesting enough, this was a completely different outcome. Now chocolate mousse E is the winner, followed by chocolate mousse D. And A is coming much lower below, much further below. So why is it different? On the next chart, we'll show you why. On the right-hand side, you see the comparison. So E was the one winning in the second scenario. And people were asked about the attributes, which I said, and among them was sweetness. And you clearly see that chocolate mousse A has a high percentage of milk chocolate and a very high amount of sugar. So when you talk about sweetness, many people start thinking about sweetness means sugar, means probably bad for my health, bad for my teeth, bad for whatever it is. We know that sugar is a baddie. So a really sweet chocolate mousse must not be the best one. And you see that chocolate mousse E has a much more balance. Well, actually, it hasn't even sugar at all. D is still high, has a much more balanced comparison of milk and dark chocolate and a little bit of sugar. But the sweetest chocolate, the one with the most sugar, must not be the best one. So you see how the asking about the attributes creates an impact on the overall evaluation, because after all, also in general, talking about attributes also gives people a measuring guideline how to evaluate the overall acceptance. And people might have completely different attributes in mind how they judge a product. We don't know how they judge a product. We only assume that the attributes we are giving are the ones that are most important. Normally, you would have to go a little more in depth to understand the real attributes that have an impact on the overall evaluation. But to overcome this, at least our recommendation is always start with the general question.
So we've got another kind of bias as well I want to talk about, and I could talk about this a lot, so I'm going to keep it really general, but cultural response bias is a huge one. So it's something we always talk about for people that have global products, global markets, always test with consumers from a range of different places. Obviously, there are really specific reasons why, because obviously they can be different ambient temperatures, different skin types, hair types, all of that kind of thing. But most importantly, there's going to be a different cultural response. So if it's not just necessarily about sort of, as I said, in that checklist, but actually finding out, will your product be accepted in the markets that you want to sell in? The best thing you can do is look at testing in those markets. But also we get an idea of, what kind of response there is in different places. So again, from the Market Research Society, I've got this really good list that kind of gives you some kind of sweeping broad terms, which we know are a rule of thumb. So certainly if you've got global markets and you know there's these real differences, I would recommend testing at least in those representative places, so you can get a really balanced overall picture of what your consumer looks like. So in Latin countries such as Southern Europe and Latin America, people tend to be much more positive than average. So this is where we might think about that acquiescence bias and really kind of negating against that. We know people are really positive, and they're even more positive in Latin countries. So what can we do to reel that in a bit? India also tends to be extremely positive, so not just a bit more positive. They tend to be kind of, I love this product. You know, we've done some great product tests in India, and I have to say they do always tend to go very, very well, because people do love them. And actually, even that's a great rule of thumb. If you test your product in India and it does badly, you've got something wrong with the product generally. So that's always quite a good country to test in if you're thinking of selling there. There's also highly collective societies, so people who see themselves as a real kind of group of people, such as Japan and South Korea, and they tend not to use extreme points on the scale, so they'll be very middle based. Something we see a lot anyway. People do tend to like a middle scale, but certainly in countries like that. So it may be trying to remove neutral answers if it's appropriate for the question, so you're steering them to either be positive or negative. And Nordic countries, so kind of Finland, but also I'll include Germany in this, even though it's not technically Nordic, do tend to be less positive, as we know. So Thomas and I often do studies where we test in each of our countries, so UK and Germany, and somewhere there in the middle, there tends to be the kind of middle response, because Germany does tend to be less positive than the UK does.
Yeah.
But again,
which also, if you compare results for one product, definitely be careful not to jump to the conclusion that it performs better in one country than the other just because the scores are higher. So you definitely need to take the country frame as a reference.
Exactly. It really, really helps to get an idea of, the idea of the bias as well that's in there. So that's certainly a really good kind of overall picture there that can help you. But how do we deal with that cultural response bias? So the best really thing to do really is to look at the benchmark of where you sit. So if you're looking at currently used products or services that are in that place that you're selling as well, you can benchmark against it. So like I said, we get a lot of clients that will test in certain countries because that's their key market. And once you've done one product test there, you get an idea of how the consumers are rating your products in general. So if, like I said, if you go to India, your product is rated really, really well and it's amazing, then you test another product there and it's not, you know that it's the product, it's not the consumers necessarily that are kind of having a negative response. So yeah, it's really good. I mean, lots of our clients, like I said, that have a global market will focus on particular markets for every consumer test because they know that's where they're going to be selling. They know it's a representative of their consumer and they know that they can look at their other products that have been tested there. So I would recommend, whenever it comes to everything we've mentioned today, so I was thinking about things like scales, all these different ways to do a bias. Generally, once you've got a good formula, the best thing you can do is stick with it. Because once you have your own products as a kind of benchmark for yourself, it will really help you with your product development and things like that to know if things are going wrong. Is it just the product, but is it the kind of consumers and things like that? So it's really important to kind of think about that. And if you haven't started doing it, think about benchmarking.
But worth actually Exactly, but benchmark with yourself. The thing is, often I ask my clients, "Don't you have benchmarks from other products?" And I most of the time say, "Well, we might have, but in the end, it's also a matter of confidentiality. We can't really share data from other clients." So.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we don't tend to share data from our other clients. That's the other thing, because obviously we don't have these kind of sweeping things. But I mean, if it's a new process for you, we work that out with you. We work out the best study design and questionnaire design for your products and research objectives. That's our speciality, and we can use that data from other clients, without saying anything.
Of course.
So that's how we sneak around that one. We know what we're looking at. But I mean, and generally, if we have clients that come to us that have already done consumer research, that's great as well, because we can look at what's already been done there. So yeah, there's certainly ways around it. And that's really what our speciality is. But exactly that kind of leads on to this one about benchmarking against brands you aspire to be. As I said, that's quite good for us generally. If people haven't done any product testing before and they say, well, this is a brand that we really want to be like, that is so helpful as well in terms of what we can do to kind of help with that test design and that questionnaire design. But yeah, and it really helps if you want to test your products against those benchmarks. Like I said, if you're launching in a new territory and you've not launched there before, you don't really know how it's accepted, great way of doing it is to test against the leading products, or at least products that you aspire to be in those countries. We get it a lot. We're currently testing a foundation for someone who's launching into the UK market, and we're testing against the top sellers over here. It just means that we've got a really good idea of where they're going to sit, because this is their first product they've ever launched. They have no benchmark at the moment. So it's a really, really good way of testing. And also, when you get to other countries that tend to be more positive, let them know you won't be offended by their honest opinion. It's a bit like we were saying about appealing to people's honesty before. It'd be amazing. It's amazing how sometimes if you just spell it out to people and say, we're not going to be offended if you don't like this product, or we're not going to be offended by any kind of honest answer. Please do let us know your honest opinion. So we can, we also, we don't have to say it necessarily that explicitly, but sometimes instead of just saying, what's your overall opinion of the product and getting some free text, we'll say, what did you like most about the product, but also what did you like the least, and kind of do it as a separate thing there. Because once people have said, oh, I love the product, it's so amazing, everything like that, and then they ask them, yeah, but is there anything you really didn't like about it? And please tell us. That can really draw that out as well. Because at the end of the day, we want to get some positive feedback, of course we do, but if you're missing all this negative feedback, by the time you launch on the market, it's a little bit too late to make any changes to that formulation that could have been found there. So that kind of applies to any country, really. So Thomas, do you want to summarize for us, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So first of all, I tend to say design a question as an art. Don't take it too lightly. I've seen quite a few people who say, well, just write down a few questions and say, make a survey and test it. Yes, you can do that, but I think you're missing out on a lot of things, and take it serious, and also talk to the experts to make sure you have a good questionnaire. Use simple language to avoid misinterpretations. We are all in the world of somehow intellectual people with this fairly good background. Be aware, not everybody is like this, and it's actually, if people misunderstand what you're talking about, you lose the value of the questions. Think of the order of question. Every question creates a frame for the following ones, and this is something to seriously think about and consider, and think of, and think of how each question can have an impact on the next one. Always start with the overall question before going into detail. That's I think I've made that point strong enough, but keep it in mind. So definitely ask the overall opinion of a product as one of the first questions. Keep in mind that every word is important and every word counts. And this is actually something that is also often underestimated in translation. So I've seen people making a nice questionnaire and then giving it to a translation office and having it translated. And we need to be aware that also language is an expression of culture, as Carys nicely also explained, and cultures also have different ways to express things. And sometimes I see it in English as a very rich language. If you've got similar words that mean similar things, or if you were to go to Greenland and ask Eskimos about the consistency of snow, you probably have 11 different words for snow, while we have one or two. You just cannot translate this. Or so when designing a questionnaire, already have the translation in mind, or work in parallel on the question and the translation to make sure actually that you don't have redundant questions or wrong questions that can be misinterpreted. And last but least, scales create a bias. So also be aware how this is an impact on the overall results when it's about numbers. You can use it to your benefit if you want to squeeze an answer in a certain direction. You can make higher or lower scales, but you need to be aware that this is a bias. But after all, of course, consult your market research specialist. In the end, we and others are here to help you.
Thanks, Thomas. So we're going to go into questions in a second, but before we do so, as Thomas says, consult your market research specialist, and I'm going to tell you why that should be us.
Yeah.
So we're an award-winning research agency, so we've won awards for things like international business and family business. We're completely compliant with the GDPR. Of course, we have to be by law, but we take it very, very seriously. We have an ISO 27001, which audits us on this process, and we have our own in-house data protection officer. We have undesirable event reporting, which I won't talk about too much today because it's not really on the topic, but if you're doing product testing, obviously it's great to know that we have that all inbuilt, as well as product liability insurance. We've got an ISO 9001, which again is an audit for our quality. We're a partner to the Market Research Society. So as I've mentioned a lot, we've got some great examples for them, and we get full training on questionnaire design that keeps us up to date with all of these really important matters. You can get bespoke regulatory advice. That is what I'm here for. So always feel free to contact me. And you always get a designated study manager. So you get one point of contact who will get to know you, as we say. If you're kind of starting off on this and you're not sure about how you should be testing your products and asking your questions, that is what we'll find out. And we'll get one kind of member of staff who'll be able to work that out and carry that forward for you for all the product tests you do. Anyway, I would love to get on to questions now. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. I know I've got some kind of chats going on. I don't know if there are any questions, but I'll have a little look now. I can see Andre shared that the chocolate mousse scenario comes from the Think Fast and Slow book. Great, exactly. I love that you know the example already. That's brilliant. So yeah, I think it's a really good example there. And it's something we can really think about with claims in general as well. As Thomas said, you know, if we're looking at product testing and thinking about maybe the overall impression before asking about the claims, I think it's a really good example. Hi Macon as well. So I just wanted to read your answer for your question first. So conducting tests in different countries, most important, adapt the terms, the scale, and manage the results for interpretation. And as Thomas said, especially when it comes to translation, absolutely. I mean, the English language is incredibly descriptive. We usually work with marketing teams who want loads of claims, and actually, especially when we go test somewhere like China, we have all of these words that mean the exact same thing. So when we get the translation back from a translation agency, you kind of look at it and go, why have I got 10 of the exact same questions here? Well, it all means exactly the same thing. So the more you can have that translation in place when you're developing the claims rather than the questionnaire, the better off we are. So hi Taylor. So for online questionnaires, wouldn't people be more inclined to fall victim to ego defense rather than in person? In-person Q&As, people would be less likely to defend their ego due to potential criticism. You would think so, but actually historically, there is research that's been conducted by the Market Research Society, and they do advise to do online questionnaires for any social desirability biases. So that, you know, that's compared to face-to-face and telephone interviews, which are classic. So that is their advice, is to put things online based on experience there.
You clearly see that online people tend to respond more open, more clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes into, you can even think about this whole thing we have now about online trolls. You know, people can be one person when they're behind a keyboard. There's no holding back, and I think that really that's kind of, yeah, it's very true. People can just say what they want behind a keyboard. Well, they wouldn't necessarily say it to your face, but it's certainly the same with questionnaires as well. And another question from Taylor as well. So do you think the reason for variations in response to positivity in different countries is due to differences in language structure? For example, I know that media considers language structure when reporting. I think it's probably a good indication as well, but I think it is, you know, we're talking about culture, and generally there are certain cultures that are much more positively minded. You know, I don't know if you've ever visited any of those countries. I remember when I went to India myself, everyone is just really nice and happy. So it's almost unsurprising that they're going to rate things that way as well. I don't know if you've got any kind of thoughts on that, Thomas.
No, I absolutely agree, and that's it is a cultural thing. It would be interesting to see in how far language, this is also reflected in language structure, but I think it's mainly really a cultural thing that just some people, if you talk to Italians, they just tend to be more positive and more outgoing, whatever. The Germans tend to scrutinize everything, talking about my own culture, and they are a bit more critical. So I think it's mainly a cultural issue that probably is also to some extent reflected in language, but I think culture comes before language.
Absolutely. So a few more questions in here. Also, Taylor, I think I've got the same. Oh, yeah, I'll say that one's done because I think you put it in both. But Marie's asked, what's your opinion on rewarding surveys participants with gifts or random selectioned winners? Well, firstly, when it comes to product testing, we're not allowed to incentivize our volunteers. So unless there was something above and beyond the kind of requirements from a normal study, because we're partnered to the Market Research Society, as I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure there's no bias in the products, and also for, like I said, for claim substantiation. And a huge bias that occurs is when people are rewarded, because obviously if you're going to get a free product or a £50 voucher for going ahead and saying it's taking part, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to answer positively, but it does sure make people do that.
Yeah.
So you get things, people do get paid for things like clinical studies, because obviously you're going to a laboratory. We've done studies where people have to come to a central location and have to have their pictures taken or something like that. And in that case, we give them, a very small incentive to say for coming out of your way. But at least then, because we're seeing them face to face as well, we can make it very, very clear that we want them to be positive. But it's a very general rule. We don't reward our participants. Yeah.
And when it comes to if you have just a survey without products, of course, then there need to be some kind of incentivization, and it can be a gift or a random or something more valuable as a kind of random gift.
Yes, so absolutely. We're doing, we've got market research surveys at the moment that are just online surveys, and they get entered into a prize draw. That's very different because they're not testing something, so they're not saying it's good or bad. We're just getting general feedback for them on their, this is to do with eye care, for example. We want to find out how they buy eye care. But it's a big survey that we needed to get people on. So.
And then I think it's just again a matter of money. Often, if you take a prize draw or a direct incentivization, so if it should create a value for the participant. And if you have a large group of participants, actually paying everyone substantially isn't really worth it. So a kind of price draw is definitely better for the client and still creates the attractiveness for the participants.
But I will put it out there, if people are listening in there using a testing house which is incentivizing their volunteers for doing product tests for in-home user trials, I would really reconsider. I mean, obviously I'll say reconsider us, but reconsider, because if the advertising standards authorities investigate you for your claims and they find that out, they could very much say your claims are uncompliant because you've incentivized volunteers. So
exactly. And it's also what in the end, and also in our panels, I don't really want to have people who do it for the money or for anything. It's really people who should be interested in the products and want to give their opinion rather than making money with it.
Exactly. I mean, we've got over 600,000 volunteers across the globe, and the ones that we incentivize for, as I said, are very, very rare. Generally, they're just doing it because they want to test out new products. And people always say, like, how do you get them to answer questionnaires? Just get a product for it. Well, people love testing new things and they love sharing their opinion. It works. So yeah, but that's kind of our thoughts on that. So I haven't got any more questions coming for now, but I will be sharing our contact details and the recording afterwards. So obviously, please feel free to reach out if you want to discuss anything else. So for now, I will just kind of summarize the presentation and continue with the end. So I just want to put your attention towards the Society of Cosmetic Scientists. They have a distance learning course in the essentials of cosmetic science, and you can find out more at their website there. There's also going to be the IFSDC Congress in September 2022. It's getting ever so close every now and then. We're now looking at how we're going to be involved, kind of in a more full-on level. So we'll definitely be there and we'll definitely love to see you. A few upcoming webinars as well for next month. Next week, I'm going to be talking about food and drink trends and any claims to do with any trends that have come out, and kind of looking at some examples that are in the industry basically and having a discussion. So that's really specific for food and drink. We've got our consumer testing checklist on the 9th of April. So essentially just going through, lots of people kind of don't know where to start when it comes to consumer research or don't think about the considerations. The more you consider, as we keep saying, the more you can develop into your new product development process. So it's looking at all those considerations. We've also got, well, I've got the essential oils webinar with Connect for Compliance, who'll be joining me for that one. On the 23rd of April, we'll be looking at the consumer insights and regulatory considerations for essential oils. So there's our information there, but as I said, I will email this out. Thank you very much for all of your kind of cooperation here, guys. Really enjoyed having you listen, but also it's been great to get some conversations going at the end there. So yeah, thank you very much for listening today, and thank you so much for joining me, Thomas.
Thank you, Carys, and thank you everybody for listening. And
everyone have a fantastic weekend.
have a great weekend. Bye-bye.